Hi everyone. So this week we are going to focus on four main types of punctuation for our grammar lesson. We're going to look at hyphens, em dashes, brackets, and semicolons. And I think that these are some of the best forms of punctuation to really use well and set yourself apart from other people by showing just how well educated you are. I think that sometimes being able to use a well-placed semicolon or em dash or knowing when or when not to use a hyphen can make you seem quite smart. And so I think as we're getting ready to go to high school, this is one of those skills that can be very beneficial in helping to form a good first impression in your writing. So let's start with hyphens. Hyphens are used a lot of times when we're writing compound words. So they're very small dashes that join together two words. Now, notice that there are words in the English language that are compound that don't require hyphens. For example, the word cupcake. Cupcake, two words, right? Cup and cake. We put them together, we make something delicious. But the thing about cupcake is because it's a compound word, it's very clear to us what we're talking about. We don't need a hyphen there. A lot of times where we see the hyphens is when we're writing out numbers. So number words use hyphens, and also words that are confusing sometimes use hyphens. So for example, when we write out a number, now you may not do this on a regular basis now, but someday, or if you've had Mrs. Heckman, maybe you've done this already, you will have to write out checks. And one of the things you do is write out the numbers. And so 27 is an example of a hyphenated number. So any numbers that you're writing out, a lot of times they have hyphens in them. Not all, but many. Fractions are the same way. So if we wanted to say 5/8, but we wanted to actually write out the words, we would use a hyphen there as well. But we also use this to avoid confusion in a sentence. So sometimes we have very unclear or ambiguous statements, and we need to clarify them. For instance, if I say the man-eating chicken, that can have two different meanings. It could be that a person is literally sitting down and enjoying a piece of chicken and eating it. But it could also mean that there is a chicken that's attacking people. It is a man-eating chicken. And that's where the hyphen comes in. So if I'm talking about a chicken that's attacking and trying to eat other people, that's the hyphenated man-eating versus a man eating chicken, which I would leave without that punctuation. It's just somebody having a chicken dinner. We also frequently use hyphens when we're talking about prefixes. So if I am setting up prefixes, particularly for words like all, X, or self, a lot of times we use the hyphen in that situation. But we sometimes also use it as part of a proper noun or as part of a number. So if you look at my example here, the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, so that's an example of a prefix. If you think back to our prefixes, our affixes from CE. Trans is a prefix meaning something's changing or moving, right? And Siberian Orchestra, that's a proper noun. This is the name of something. So they're using the hyphen in that context. And that's one of the rules for hyphens. We also sometimes see this in a prefix being used with numbers. So like mid-1990s. That's another time when we would see hyphens being used. In addition, when we are looking at prefixes that end in a vowel and a root word that start with a vowel, we often use the hyphen to join that prefix to the root word in words, for example, like reoccur or autoimmune, because we don't want those two vowels sitting next to each other. Again, that can sometimes cause confusion when you're reading the words, especially if there are E's. A lot of E's in a row can be very confusing. So that's one way that we also use hyphens. The final way that we're going to talk about is when we are using two words together to modify a noun. So as an adjective, and we're giving more information about that noun, a lot of times, especially if they're number words, we're going to hyphenate them. So for instance, 20th century novels would be hyphenated because I'm saying the time period and I'm using those number words. But notice if I move it to the end and I make it a prepositional phrase and still sharing the same information, I'm just doing it differently grammatically. Novels from the 20th century, I no longer need that hyphen. So it depends. If you're saying my 9-year-old cousin, I would hyphenate 9-year-old. But if I say my cousin is 9 years old, then I don't need the hyphens anymore. So it depends on where you're placing the information in the sentence too. Now, a lot of times students get confused because they think about hyphens and then they see em dashes and they put them together in their head and conflate them and think they're the same thing. But in fact, em dashes are very different. So hyphens are very small dashes that we use typically by themselves, just one at a time, occasionally more than one, but usually one at a time to link together two words. Em dashes are longer dashes that we use to highlight information in the sentence, and they're something that we can use in place of parentheses. So if you think about how you would put something in parentheses in a sentence to set off material, it's very similar, but the difference is that parentheses usually make things fade into the background, where em dashes pull things to somebody's attention. So it depends on what you're trying to do in the sentence. So I gave you some examples here to think about. When students turned in their late work more than one day, they lost many points. Or if you really wanted to highlight that one day piece, you could use the em dash. When students turned in their late work more than one day, they lost many points. Notice that the parentheses sort of pull the information to the background. The em dashes bring it to the front. Now, if you're putting this information at the end of the sentence, you only need one em dash. So it's a little different than parentheses in that way. For example, you can see here, I bumped into my BFF when I was out shopping, or rather wandering aimlessly around the store. The alternative would be just one em dash. I bumped into my BFF when I was out shopping, or rather wandering aimlessly around the store. Notice how in this placement, because it's at the end of the sentence, I only need that one em dash, and I don't need to do anything at the end of the sentence but put my period. Now, we can also use em dashes where we would use colons. Colons we often use to make a list of things. And this is a way that you could also highlight your list. So if you want to call attention to it. The beach had everything: warm water, clean beaches, and wonderful restaurants. Notice how with the colon, I'm just making the list, but with the em dash, it highlights that list a little bit more. So if you feel like there's important information in your list, you might want to use the em dash instead of the colon. You can also use it to represent part of a word. So if you have a no-no word in your sentence, in my example, when the cook burned his hand, he hopped around the kitchen yelling, "Holy blank, that hurts," right? So think about how you can use those blanks to help you. If you're trying to create characterization, that might be a place where an em dash would be appropriate as well to keep you from writing no-no words in your stories or in your essays. You can also use it in place of commas for an appositive if you want to call attention to the information in the appositive phrase. Remember, appositives are noun phrases that are renaming. We learned about those in our phrases activity a few weeks ago. So speak with your LA teacher, Mrs. Azef, if you have any questions about your work. This just calls attention to who you're supposed to talk to. And that's another way that we can use em dashes to kind of draw our attention into something in the sentence. The final thing that we're going to think about with em dashes is interruptions. So sometimes when someone is talking and they're interrupted, we can show that by using an em dash. So if you're making dialogue, that can be a way to incorporate an em dash. Okay, friends, Marie, sit down until I'm done with the directions. Let's get started with our lesson for today. So notice how there's an interruption there as one person is talking to a group and then to an individual and then back to the group. Or, Brian, can you help? Oh, never mind. Right? So the em dash shows that there's some sort of an interruption there and then change of thought. So another way that you can incorporate it into your writing. Now, brackets are a little different. We've talked about brackets already when we were talking about our quotations from the Pearl. So brackets are generally used in quotations to clarify something or to give important background information that's not in the quotation but that the reader needs to know. So for instance, if I was going to pull a piece of text and it said, he ran down the beach, well, maybe there's like 5 or 6 different male characters in this story, so I need to know which he are we talking about. Instead of he, I might put in brackets, Kino, right? So that way I know which character is being talked about, but I have to show that I put it in there. It's not the words of John Steinbeck, it's the words of Mrs. Azef. So I use the brackets to show that that's information I'm adding to the story. Now, a lot of times you see this in newspaper articles when a reporter wants to give some more information other than the specific thing that was quoted by the person that's being interviewed. So here's a great example from the newspaper. Mike Hannon said, after the ship comes back to shore, Captain Donald, the boat's owner, will have a lot of explaining to do. Now, if I don't know who Captain Donald is, I might not understand the context of what's happening in this newspaper article. So the writer of the article is adding in that information to help me to better understand what's happening. The final piece of punctuation we're going to talk about this week is the semicolon. Now, we've started this when we were talking about run-on sentences, but we also talked about it with compound sentences. Semicolons are used 2 main ways in the English language. The first way is to connect 2 independent clauses, 2 clauses that can stand alone. We can join them together in the place of a fanboy's word with a comma, and instead of comma fanboys, we could use a semicolon and link those 2 sentences together. I went to the store, semicolon, I bought bread. Okay, those 2 things, the 2 ideas kind of go together, so the semicolon is holding them together, 2 independent clauses, as one complete sentence. But the other way that we can use semicolons in English is when we have a really complicated list of things and commas are getting out of control. Then we would use semicolons to separate out the things in the list. So if you've got a list with tons of commas, you want to consider using the semicolon as a stronger comma to kind of break together different pieces of information. For example, I went to the beach with Michael, my cousin, semicolon, Jerry, my best friend, semicolon, and Fred, my uncle. Notice how there are 3 different appositive phrases: my cousin, my best friend, my uncle. 3 noun phrases that are renaming the people so that we have more information about them. If I had had all commas in a row, I wouldn't know if I meant Michael, my cousin, Jerry, my best friend, Fred, and my uncle. 6 people or just 3. So by adding in those semicolons, I'm being more specific and I'm saying Michael, my cousin, that's 1 person. Jerry, my best friend, that's another person. And Fred, my uncle, is the 3rd person. So it's creating a lot of clarity in the sentence by adjusting the punctuation. This is also really helpful when you're listing cities and states. So if I'm saying Lexington, Kentucky, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York, New York, I might want to separate those by saying Lexington, comma, Kentucky, semicolon, Philadelphia, comma, Pennsylvania, semicolon, and New York, comma, New York. So that it's clear that, again, I'm talking about 3 distinct places rather than 6 locations. Okay, so I hope that helps you to better understand how to use these 4 different types of punctuation. As always, I'm available for questions. Please reach out to me if you need any help. Once you've reviewed this information and you feel confident that you are ready to move on, you can take the assessment in Schoology. Remember, though, that is a grade in hack based on accuracy. So take your time, review this information carefully, and then do your best work. I hope to see you online this week. Have a great one, guys. See you soon. Bye-bye.